I'm your host, Pat Poblete. I'm joined this week by Colorado Politics political correspondent Ernest Luning. Ernest, how are you doing?
I'm doing good,
So, Ernest, we're chatting here in the aftermath, a couple days after the 2022 Colorado primary election. So we're going to save you kind of an overview of the results, although you can read that just below us if you're watching here on coloradopolitics.com. The kind of top line takeaway that we reported and a lot of other outlets have reported is essentially the more traditional wing of the Republican Party had a very, very good night earlier this week. And Ernest, that's something I wanted to kick off our conversation talking about, because we should shift our focus now from the primary onto the general election. And we heard a lot, I think, in the wake of Tuesday night's results about kind of the electability of this slate of Republican candidates. We had a quote on Colorado Politics about this is the sanity slate, I believe, is referred to this slate of Republican candidates. Let's talk about the reality of that slate running in what is increasingly becoming a blue Colorado. Yes, Republicans opted for more electable candidates, most would say, but are they actually going to be elected come the election this fall?
Well, Pat, we're actually going to have an election over the next 4 months, with both sides having a chance in some of these races. You know, if some of the let's call them the upstart candidates, the ones who aren't part of the establishment, let's say Ron Hanks in the Senate race, Greg Lopez in the governor's race, and Tina Peters in the Secretary of State's race, if any of them had won their primaries, we probably would be looking at a very different path to November in Colorado, because national Republicans would have said, yeah, you know, those guys on the ticket are going to take Colorado off the board for Republicans. And there were a number of Republican strategists, longtime consultants and candidates, and let's call the elder statesmen of the party, who shared the same worry. And that's one reason they came out swinging so hard. You know, if you looked at the endorsements, Joe O'Dea, Heidi Ganahl, Pam Anderson, running for Senate, governor, and Secretary of State, respectively, they had the full backing of the establishment. The other candidates who came up through the caucus and assembly system did not. As it turned out, the races weren't terribly close. And some would attribute that to Colorado's semi-open primary system, which allows unaffiliated voters to vote in the major party candidates' primaries. And for the first time, it looks like that might have made a big difference this year. O'Dea and Ganahl only won by about 9-10 points. You know, if it had just been Republicans voting in those races, I think there's a pretty good chance that Hanks and Lopez would have been the nominees. The Secretary of State's race, it was a little different. Tina Peters, frankly, most voters don't pay that much attention to the Secretary of State primary any year. This year, if any of them got their ballots and started Googling, they saw 7 felony indictments and that she'd been arrested in a Grand Junction coffee shop and might have kicked at a police officer. You know, she probably wasn't going to win that race, even if it was only Republicans. But since the unaffiliated voters were voting, they might have helped moderate the ticket and given Republicans candidates who can actually go up against the Democratic incumbents in November.
So I want to pick up right there in terms of going up against the Democratic incumbents. And you mentioned 3 big races, so I want to focus on those 3. It's governor, U.S. Senate, and Secretary of State, 3 statewide races. I don't want to ask you to get your crystal ball out and make a prediction, but rather looking at the candidate, looking at the environment, looking at kind of the factors that are going into that, who has the best environment out of those 3 to knock off a Democratic incumbent?
Well, Pat, I want to add 2 other statewide races, and those were races that didn't have primaries on either side. That's John Kellner running for Attorney General on the Republican ticket, and Lang Sias, former state lawmaker who ran for Lieutenant Governor 4 years ago, running for state treasurer. They're running against the Democratic incumbents, Phil Weiser and Dave Young. Now, I'm going to say those 2 probably are on the easiest glide path to a real toss-up in November. You know, for a number of reasons, and that's partly because those two races are kind of obscure. A lot of Coloradans don't really know what the attorney general or the state treasurer do. This year, the election environment favors the Republicans in both of those because the crime rate is high and inflation is high. Voters are worried about safety, public safety, and the economy. And the attorney general and the state treasurer might bear the brunt of that, even though the Colorado attorney general and the Colorado state treasurer don't really have much to do with any of that. In voters' minds, that might be a way to strike back against an environment that everyone agrees, is not great for incumbents, and it is not great that voters would like to take out some frustration on. Now, going back to those other three races, though, where we've got Joe O'Dea taking on Michael Bennet for the Senate race, Heidi Ganahl taking on Governor Jared Polis, and Pam Anderson facing Secretary of State Jenna Griswold. You've got to think that, and this is only because this is the way elections work here in Colorado and around the country. The Senate race is going to be the barometer for how voters are feeling about national things. It's a midterm election with a Democrat in the White House. The Republicans are going to be pointing out accurately that Michael Bennet has sided with Joe Biden on just about everything in the Senate. So Joe O'Dea and his supporters are going to have a credible argument to say, hey, you want to strike cast a vote against Joe Biden, vote against Michael Bennet. So Michael Bennett's going to have a tough time. That's a tougher connection to make for voters, and particularly for candidates for governor. It often, Colorado's gubernatorial elections for the last 60 years have been in the presidential midterm, and they have not reflected the national mood. Coloradans see their governor almost every day. They're familiar with him. Coloradans have a firm opinion about the governor. They all through the pandemic, we were hearing from Jared Polis on a daily basis. People see them when they get their driver's license registration booklets. People are familiar with their governor, so it's tough for a campaign to shape public opinion on that and change things. Unlike in a Senate race or virtually any other race.
So Ernest, that's a good breakdown of the Republican side. We spent a lot of time talking about Republicans. Now let's flip over to the other side and talk about Democrats. And it was a pretty sleepy night overall for Democrats, outside of a few House races here and there that really drew interest. For the most part, incumbents rolled, and there wasn't a whole lot to write about. One of the things that did kind of catch headlines related to Democrats in the lead up to this election was Democrats spent quite a bit of money propping up those less electable candidates that you talked about earlier, Ron Hanks, Greg Lopez, in certain cases, Tina Peters. Or not Tina Peters, rather, but those first two, certainly. Yeah. So I'm curious, in the aftermath, now that we know the results of this election, where those candidates did not have a very good night, what's the future viability of this strategy in terms of an opposition party dumping a whole bunch of money into a primary in hopes of getting a less electable opponent in the general?
Oh, well, we'll see. It's not that the strategy failed so much as that it failed here in Colorado with these particular candidates. There were some specific circumstances that, Joe O'Dea and Heidi Ganahl and outside groups supporting those two candidates had the money to fight back. They went on the airwaves. They took their time, but they went on the airwaves, and they basically ran against the Democrats trying to interfere in the primary. That probably had some effect. There was another, that tactic might work better in states without semi-open primaries. In Colorado, I heard from a ton of people, all those ads, and just to let viewers know if they weren't real familiar, the Democrats spent millions of dollars taking these candidates with virtually no statewide name ID, Ron Hanks and Greg Lopez, and putting them on TV screens every time you turn the TV on. It was saying, here are these guys, they're too conservative. They support Trump's border wall. They don't want any gun control. They're opposed to abortion without exception. Now, if it were just Republicans voting who hadn't really done their homework and didn't really know all these candidates, that might have swayed a bunch of them to say, "Oh, okay, I've seen a couple Joe Day commercials, but I like the cut of this Ron Hanks's jib." What they didn't take into account is there were hundreds of thousands of unaffiliated voters watching these same commercials. And this is anecdotal, but I heard from a lot of folks. They said they were watching those and said, "Well, okay, I'm not going to vote for them, and I'm going to vote in the Republican primary because there are no choices in the Democratic primary." And that I think had as much to do with the outcome as the Republicans pushing back, which they did. I'll point out, though, this tactic did work in Illinois this year. The let's say more fringe gubernatorial candidate won on the Republican side after Democrats played heavily in that primary. So I think that's still going to be an arrow in the quiver that the parties use, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the Republicans try it in future Colorado primaries the way they did 2 years ago. Let's be clear: a lot of the Republicans clutching their pearls over the Democrats getting involved in their primary applauded 2 years ago when the Republicans were doing the same in Colorado's Senate primary. Didn't work then, didn't work now.
So, Ernest, I want to close out, and I'm going to give you a multiple choice here and let you take your pick. But there are two congressional races that I'm particularly interested, but I haven't seen a ton of discourse on. Now, of course, I know you covered them on the election night, and if you're interested, you can read just below us on coloradopolitics.com. But I'm talking specifically about CD7 and CD8. Now, I'll take your pick. Pick one of those. Let's go into depth a little bit on the general election matchup we anticipate seeing in one of these Metro Denver area congressional districts.
Well, the reason those two districts are the ones you brought up is because they're both open seats. In every other congressional district in the state, all the other 6, you've got incumbents running for re-election, and they're heavily favored. These two districts, though, Ed Perlmutter's retiring the 7th, leaving an open seat, and the 8th district up north of Denver, stretching up from Adams County suburbs up to Greeley, that's a brand new district, and it's a true swing district. So let's talk about that one. Barb Kirkmeyer, who's a longtime county commissioner up in Weld County, who was elected to the state Senate a couple years ago and has been serving there, won the primary by a wide margin against 3 other candidates, including a quite conservative primary rival, Lori Sain, who actually benefited also from some Democratic ads trying to say she was too conservative. The voters went with Barb Kirkmeyer, gave her a solid win in that district. She's got experience campaigning, and she'll be going up against Yadira Caraveo, who's a state representative from Thornton, who's also a pediatrician. Now, on paper, she's almost the ideal Democratic candidate, especially in a district which is it's considered Colorado's Hispanic influence district. It has about 35% Hispanic population, which is the highest of any district in the state. And it was drawn specifically to be a district where Hispanics can have a serious influence on the outcome. This year, with a Republican wave coming down from the horizon, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. The vote is going to be more Republican this year in Colorado than in a typical year. Kirkmeyer's probably got the edge, and we're going to see. That's going to be the one congressional district in Colorado that's going to see millions of dollars in outside spending. Both the National Republicans and the National Democrats, the House GOP and the House Democratic groups, have already reserved. I think we're getting close to $10 million in advertising. If you live in Thornton or if you live in Greeley, your TVs are going to be wall to wall about Barb Kirkmeyer and Yadira Caraveo starting in about September. So, brace yourselves. But that's going to be the real fight this year. And, let's just say in an ordinary year, it would be a strict toss up. This year, I think Kirkmeyer's got the edge.
Well, I know that you'll be covering it, and you'll be able to break down all that's going on in that race, both news and analysis wise. So you can read Ernest on Colorado Politics. One more time, plugging his work from election night is just below us if you're reading on Colorado Politics. If not, go ahead and navigate over there. Ernest, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. For Ernest, I'm Pat. Thank you again for joining us this week, and we will see you again soon.